This is the oldest, and it goes here, and then here, and then here. So in the earliest version, you see the winged death's head, which sort of evolves into a weird sort of abstract winged something thing. I don't know what to call that. Right? This is the winged cherub's head. This is much friendlier. And then let's just get rid of all references to the spirit world altogether. By the 19th century, we have the weeping willow over the urn imagery. And if you go through cemeteries in New England and you count these things up, and one of the beauties, the reason archaeologists use these is because headstones are naturally dated, so we can date precisely when these were carved. And so you can construct a graph of the frequency of the winged death's head, which is the most frequent from the late 18th century. It starts to die out towards in the 1780s, where the winged cherub starts to pick up, and it dies out again and is finally replaced into the 19th century by the weeping willow and urn. And this is just essentially reflecting changing attitudes towards death in New English and in American society. Not only are you taming the gravestone, and the cherubs have become, or the skulls become cherubs, but the memento moris at the same time are being tamed. This is a 16th century death's head ring. Okay? This is a 19th century funeral ring, which says, "My dear mother." Not nearly as scary as, "Behold the end." And of course, this is a brooch that does the functional equivalent, which again showed the weeping willow and the mausoleum stone. And this is reflecting a shift to a Victorian attitude towards death, in which bodies are now in the process of someone's post-death movement, the movement of the body. Bodies are now being embalmed to allow time for guests to gather for a funeral, and preserving and displaying the visage of the dead in hopes of the reunion in the afterlife, rather than as a reminder of the horrors of hell. So you see the focus is moving from worry about damnation to look forward to the reunion in the second coming. Now, to this point, what I've done is tried to suggest that there are several themes about death and its object. One is that those objects have the ability to tap or direct spiritual power. The second is that there was a popular European and American culture that expected an intact corpse, partly in the hopes of the resurrection of the body. And third is the objects of death could be used to focus the mind on the inevitability of death and the necessary spiritual preparation for it. And fourth is the fact that all of those attitudes and the objects associated with them shifted over time. Now, what I want to do is tell you a story about the Continental Army. That is Washington's Continental Army during the American Revolution. And as I suggested at the beginning, the full interpretive meaning of this story is not yet clear to me. I don't think I've got a locked handle on exactly what this means. But I can tell you the story, and I can suggest a couple of things in part based on this sort of run-through of the way Europeans and Americans thought about death. So in July of 1778, a joint Tory and Iroquois Indian raid in northeastern Pennsylvania, led by John Butler, destroyed a local militia force under Zebulon Butler, not related, in the battle at Forty Fort, the main defense for the Wyoming settlements in Pennsylvania. And that attack and battle was then reported and described as a massacre to the people who heard about it. Washington decided that this incident and others like it necessitated that they launch a punitive expedition against the Iroquois and their upstate New York Tory allies to restore confidence on the frontier. And he sent in the spring and summer of 1779 4,000 Continental soldiers to march into the Iroquois country. And the larger part of that army marched into the Wyoming area from New Jersey and southern Pennsylvania. This is an original map of the expedition, which is difficult for you to see, so we have a more modern version. There's two separate Continental armies. One starts down here, one starts over here, and they march to join together here, and then go off into the Finger Lakes area of upstate New York and march around through Iroquois country, tearing things up. That's the basic plan. Now, it was a march that was filled, for the soldiers involved, with omens of death. Not least their encampment on the edge of a swamp locally named the Shades of Death. That was the place name. But also Hell's Kitchen, Devil's Parlor, Damnation Alley. They walked through and camped in all of these places. And these are recorded in their diaries. In fact, one of the things that makes this particular campaign so interesting is that the soldiers involved, to a very large and unusual extent, created in diaries which have survived. And down to not just officers, lieutenants, and sergeants, but to private soldiers. They're relatively uncommon in the 18th century from private soldiers. And from this particular campaign, we get a little proliferation of them. And in part, it's because they were doing something they considered unusual. This campaign against the Indians into upstate New York for them was a march into the deepest wilderness of North America. And it's also important to remember that almost all 18th century campaign diaries, whether they're by soldiers or by officers, tend to be very, very laconic. They say things like, "It rained." "We marched 10 miles. It rained again." They're deeply, deeply boring documents. These campaign journals are surprisingly wordy. They're very descriptive. I mean, there are moments when all they can get around to saying is "it rained," because that's all they can manage that day. But many of the entries in the diaries are quite descriptive. And one of the most interesting things that happens to them is that when they arrive in Wyoming, down here where the massacre was, where this battle that was reported as a massacre was, when they arrive in Wyoming, they're taken on a tour of the massacre site, which is this fabulous, unexpected moment of battlefield tourism in the 18th century. And it's almost a year after to the day from the battle the previous year. Now keep in mind that as I said, most diary entries don't say very much. And listen to what they say, I'm going to give you some examples of what they say while they were being taken on this tour of the battlefield site. One man named Norris, he sort of describes the battlefield. He says there was this hill, there was that space, there was this creek, they ran across the creek. He identifies the location where the retreat started, and then he says, "We saw the signs of a speedy retreat that led to the massacre of 200 men. We saw more or less of bones scattered over the ground for near 2 miles, and several skulls brought in at different times that had been scalped and inhumanly mangled with the hatchet. Our guide showed us where 73 bodies had been buried in one hole. This place may with propriety be called Golgotha, a melancholy picture of savage rage and desolation." Colonel Dearborn, in a different document, a different diary, said, "We found a great number of bones at and near the field of battle. Among a number of skull bones that we found, none was without the mark of a tomahawk. I saw one grave where 73 of our men were buried, and was shown a place where 17 of our men were taken, after being taken, were made to sit down in a ring, 16 of whom they immediately tomahawked, the other escaped." Another witness said, "We took a review of the remains of 40 Fort. 2 skulls were shown us, which were picked up near the field of battle, and with a variety of other human bones had lain unburied for 12 months past. From the appearance of the skulls, which were most shockingly gashed and bruised, it is evident that the poor creatures must have suffered amazingly." We went to the field where the 2 butlers fought last summer. There were about 400 men killed, and most of them scalped and received the tomahawk. Last, we were shocked by seeing a grave which contained 75 persons and men's skulls which had been stuck through with tomahawks. Now, to me, this is a fascinating bit of battlefield tourism. It comes complete with a local guide who fleshes out the story, brings them to the bones, brings them to the mass grave, and tells them anecdotes about specific cruelties that supposedly happened, including supposedly one brother killing another brother even as he tried to surrender. What all the diarists zoom in on, however, was the damage to the skulls and the horrors of a mass grave. None even considered the possibility that the scalping had occurred after death. Instead, they assumed suffering while being scalped alive. But even setting that aside, there is a horror here at the treatment of the body. And I think it's a horror that's rooted in this deep-seated popular culture that wants that moment of public mourning, that gathers guests for a funeral, and that looks forward to the reunion of the whole body in the afterlife. Mangled skulls, unburied bodies, unmourned relatives belie the promise of a second life. Now, these same men, however, these same soldiers, made some interesting choices in their immediate future. There are any number of accounts that I could tell you of American soldiers or militiamen scalping and killing Indians in horrible ways, and so it should be no surprise to you when I tell you that that is a part of the rest of the story. But there are interesting twists here as well. The meaning of the objects of death and their relationship to the act of killing are in contention. There is debate. There is dispute about what is appropriate to do. As the Americans scoured the woods in the wake of the fleeing Indians after the Battle of Newtown, which occurs after the two armies have united and they go north, they are attacked, or they are attempted to be attacked by a force of Iroquois and Tories, and they defeat them and chase them off. And as the Americans are scouring the woods afterwards, they find 12 dead, and they took 2 prisoners. The differing accounts of those dead, and of the prisoners, and of their fates, tells an interesting story of prejudice, and blindness, and differential treatment. Virtually all the, now you have to bear with me here, there's some numbers are going to come up, but I'll get to it at the end, but hang on. Virtually all accounts agree that the Americans took 2 prisoners. Most acknowledge that one prisoner was white, a Tory who had feigned being dead, and the other was a Negro. Quote, for some diarists, the prisoner's race was irrelevant. They were merely, quote, 2 Tory. One noted that the white man was in fact a, quote, painted Tory. Does that mean he had dressed and fought like an Indian, or was he merely tarred by association fighting on behalf of Indians? Now that's one thing, but the picture gets stranger and murkier with regards to the treatment of the Indian dead. One source specified that 11 dead Indian men and 1 dead Indian woman were the 12 total. Another noted that the troops scalped 11 of the dead. Well, okay, that sounds okay. There's 11 dead men, and they scalped those, but they didn't scalp the dead woman. The logic sort of makes sense from our point of view. But other counts contradict. One of the best witnesses, that is one of the more complete witnesses, Lieutenant Barton, reported 11 or 12 Indian dead, all of whom he said the soldiers scalped. Sullivan's report, Sullivan, the commander of the expedition, his official report merely listed 12 dead, 1 a woman. Were the Americans reluctant to scalp a woman, or were they simply reluctant to admit doing it? Or was it so common as to not be worth mentioning? Of 31 descriptions of the battle, only 4 mention that one of the dead was a woman, which is a detail that no one invented. There's no reason to invent that particular detail. 10 of the accounts acknowledge the scalping of the Indian dead, claiming anywhere from 5 to 20, although we're almost sure the real total was 12. Now, by 1779, for Americans to scalp dead Indian warriors was no real surprise, and should not surprise any of us. But some men clearly had qualms about the scalping of a woman, or they at least had qualms about talking about it. Others had fewer concerns and went much further. Ensign Daniel Gookin hinted darkly at worse matters in his journal, saying that the soldiers had taken several Indian scalps, etc., etc., etc. End quote. 3 other diarists filled in those blanks for us, informing posterity that the soldiers had skinned the legs of 2 of the Indian dead, dressed the skin into leggings, and presented them to their officers. Lieutenant Rudolphus van Hovenberg of New York recorded the event, but decided to abbreviate it in his diary like this. His diary is otherwise free of abbreviation. It's the only thing he abbreviates. If you can't figure that out, it's some skinned by our soldiers for boots. His diary, was he ashamed? Was he embarrassed? Sergeant Thomas Roberts of New Jersey was more matter of fact. He described the incident without comment, while Lieutenant Barton seemed not to hesitate to accept the leggings as a gift from his men. One last sordid detail emerges in the interview of John Jones, a Continental deserter who was captured by the British in February. He claimed that a major in the Continental Army paid 2 soldiers a gallon of whiskey to make the leggings. Now, I don't want to digress here into the causes and nature of the long history of mutual atrocity amongst Indians and Europeans. It was mutual, it was long, and it was ugly. But speaking only of the objects of death, there seems to me to be a real divergence taking place here. The soldiers' reaction to the veritable Golgotha at Wyoming showed the power that still resided in the objects of death. The bones of men a year dead, perhaps tapping ancient fears of a dismembered resurrection, retained their ability to influence, to motivate, to inflame. The bones demanded revenge, thereby granting a measure of peace in the afterlife to those men. But what about the scalping of Indians? Clearly those objects, those scalps, don't possess the meaning they did for Indians. But taking them seemed to serve some emotive function for the soldiers who did so. There was a strong tradition in colonial warfare of taking scalps for the purposes of collecting a bounty. The Continental Army did not award bounties to Continental soldiers for that purpose. So there's no financial reward for taking scalps. So was it simply a token of revenge? Is this an object of death that symbolizes the revenge only? If so, how could they mentally separate their own actions from the Indians' actions, which they remain capable of loudly condemning? They can literally, in one breath, say the Indians are savages because they scalp, and then say we scalp the dead, in the same sentence. Scalping was prime evidence of Indian barbarity. Could they not see that they themselves were doing the same thing? Were they not capable of recognizing their own barbarity? That they were capable is suggested by the fact they had qualms about scalping a woman. At least some of them did. On the other hand, the story behind the worst act of all, from our point of view, the making of the legging from the skin of other men, suggests an emerging new meaning for objects, a meaning now derived from their value, from the role of capital in their production. Skulls as reminders of the afterlife and its complexities could still motivate and inflame, but leggings paid for with whiskey? Have even the objects of death become components of exchange? In this story, attitudes towards death and its meanings are changing, and change is slow. But it seems to me that what were once objects of spiritual power and meaning have now, in this transaction, become base matter indeed. Do you guys have questions? People usually do. Usually revolve around scalping.
What's the most common way of scalping, dead or alive?
Well, the vast preference is to take a prisoner. The most significant object that you can take from the battlefield is a prisoner. And so if you can't take a live prisoner and you've killed someone, then you take their scalp. And so the weaponry and the tactics are designed for taking prisoners. Before European tomahawks, because tomahawks are European, right? They're metal. Right? So before European tomahawks, the weapon of choice after the bow is the club. And you whack somebody on the head, and if they're still breathing after that, then you can come back and take them prisoner. If they're not still breathing, then you take their scalp. It is possible to survive being scalped if you're alive. So it's like somebody knocks you on the head and they're in a hurry, then they'll scalp you and move on to the next person, and you can survive that. And there are lots of stories of people living the rest of their life scalpless. The preference is, the assumption usually when you're scalped is that you were dead. So that's the more common. Yes?
In your history of archaeology, have you found other emblems of curses, like the one in the skull from the Brady?
Me personally, no, I have not, although there are quite a few famous examples. The Romans would scratch a curse on a lead sheet, like a little lead square, and then roll it up and stuff it in appropriate places where the cursed person might pass, for example. And the curse would, in fact, have any of you seen Rome, the HBO series?